Zora looked at the glass, then up at the King of Thorns, her eyes dancing with a sharp, dangerous light. "I'll take the partnership," she said, her voice like silk over steel. She leaned in closer, her smile widening just enough to show she still held the power. "But I'm still not giving you ice in your water, Vane." The skeleton of Bistro Noir stood against the gray city skyline, a hollowed-out monument to a night that had rewritten the city's power structure. Scaffold up the blackened stone walls like a spider's web, and the rhythmic sound of hammers and saws replaced the once haunting silence of the explosion. A week had passed since the floor turned to glass and the air to fire. The smell of charred mahogany still lingered, but it was being slowly drowned out by the scent of fresh sawdust and industrial primer. In the center of the construction zone, amidst the dust and the din, Zora stood. She wasn't wearing the starched, subservient blue of a waitress anymore. Instead, she wore a sharp, charcoal gray trench coat over a dark turtleneck that concealed the geometric ink on her collar. Her hair was pulled back tight, revealing the cold, observant clarity of a woman who no longer had a reason to hide. She stood with her hands in her pockets, watching a team of workers struggle to hoist a new marble slab onto the bar. She didn't look like a victim of a terrorist hit. She looked like the architect of the building's resurrection. The workers suddenly went quiet, the clatter of tools dropping off as a familiar, heavy vibration rolled through the room. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their engines idling like growling beasts. From the lead vehicle stepped Vane Thorax. He was still wrapped in bandages beneath his bespoke black suit, his movements slightly stiff, but his presence was as gargantuan as ever. At 6'8", he towered over the construction foreman, his sharp jawline set in a mask of grim determination. He stepped over a pile of debris, his polished leather shoes crunching on the grit. In the past, Vane would have entered this room with a snap of his fingers, demanding attention before he even crossed the threshold. He would have expected the invisible girl to scurry toward him with a glass of water and a bowed head. But as he approached the bar where Zora stood, the King of Thorns did something his men had never seen him do. He stopped 5 feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't demand. He simply stood there in the dust, his massive frame draped in shadows, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Zora took her time. She finished watching the marble slab settle into place before she slowly turned her head. Her gaze met his, level, piercing, and entirely devoid of fear. There was no longer a gap between them, no hierarchy of boss and servant. There were only two predators standing in the ruins of a shared war. "You're healing well, Vane," she said, her voice a cool, steady melody that cut through the distant sound of a circular saw. Vane took a single step forward, his eyes roaming over the scars he knew were hidden beneath her coat. "I have a good doctor," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration in his chest, "and I had a better guardian." He looked around the skeletal remains of the bistro, his tattooed hand resting on the edge of the new marble. "I'm buying the block. All of it. I'm turning this place into a fortress, but it needs a heart. It needs someone who knows how to see the shadows before they move." Zora tilted her head, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I told you, Vane. I'm retired. I like the quiet." "The quiet is a lie, Zora. We both know that," Vane said, his voice dropping into a tone of genuine, uncharacteristic respect. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy silver key, placing it on the bar between them. He didn't push it toward her like a bribe. He left it there like an offering. "I'm not here to offer you a job. I have enough employees. I have enough people who fear me." He leaned forward, his massive silhouette almost swallowing her. "I'm offering a partnership, a seat at the head of the table. I need your eyes, your mind, and your lethality. Not as my shadow, but as my equal." The air between them grew thick with the weight of the proposal. The workers stayed back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. For the first time in his life, Vane Thorax was asking instead of taking. He was offering a throne to the woman he had once called disposable, realizing that his empire was only as strong as the person standing beside him. Zora looked at the silver key, then back up at the giant who stood before her. She saw the sincerity in his cold gaze, the debt of blood that would never truly be repaid. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his tattooed hand as she took the key. She didn't bow. She didn't thank him. She simply claimed what was hers. Vane watched her, a rare, genuine spark of satisfaction in his eyes. He signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward with a bottle of mineral water. Vane took the glass and held it out to her, a silent gesture of the new world they were building. The heavy basement doors, already battered from the night's violence, were suddenly thrown wide as the cavalry finally arrived. A phalanx of Vane Thorax's elite enforcers charged into the boiler room, their tactical lights cutting through the thick, humid haze like jagged white blades. They were a sea of black Kevlar and high-caliber weaponry, moving with the practiced aggression of men who had spent their lives reclaiming territory. The lead soldier, a scarred veteran named Jax, swept his rifle across the room, his eyes widening as he took in the carnage. 4 of Cassian's top-tier hitmen were folded into the concrete, looking less like professional soldiers and more like scrap metal. In the center of the wreckage stood Zora, her frame half hidden by the massive, wounded silhouette of their boss. Vane was draped over Zora's shoulder, his 6'8" stature forcing her to lean into him to keep them both upright. His crimson waistcoat was now entirely black with gore, and his face was a map of exhaustion and pale shock. Zora didn't look like a victim being rescued. She looked like the sole survivor of an apocalypse she had personally authored. The soot on her face and the blood on her hands gave her the appearance of a dark angel carved from the very shadows of the basement. Her eyes didn't squint against the bright, tactical lights. She stared back at the armed men with a chilling, predatory neutrality that made Jax's finger tighten instinctively on his trigger. "Boss!" Jax shouted, signaling his men to converge. "We've got the perimeter secure. Medics are 2 minutes out. Let's get you clear." 2 of the larger enforcers rushed forward, their intent clear. They moved to shoulder Zora aside, viewing her as nothing more than a civilian hindrance, a poor waitress who had somehow managed to get caught in the crossfire. One of them reached out a heavy, gloved hand to shove Zora away from Vane's side, his voice rough with dismissive urgency. "Move it, sweetheart. We'll take him from here. Go stand by the wall and wait for the police." The air in the boiler room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. Before the enforcer's hand could make contact with Zora's shoulder, a sound erupted from Vane Thorax that silenced the hum of the machinery. It wasn't a groan of pain or a plea for help. It was a primal, chest-shaking roar that carried the full weight of the Thorax legacy. Despite his shattered ribs and the blood loss that should have laid him flat, Vane lunged forward, his massive, tattooed hands snapping out to catch his own man by the throat. "Don't you touch her!" Vane bellowed, his voice a tectonic shift that echoed off the concrete walls. He shoved the enforcer back with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength that sent the man staggering into his comrades. Vane swayed, his knees buckling, but he refused to let go of Zora's arm. He leaned back into her, his weight heavy and honest, publicly acknowledging the woman who had just carried his life through the fire. The enforcers froze, their rifles dipping in confusion. Jack stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Boss, she's just a waitress. We need to get you to the safe house. We'll handle the witness." Vane looked Jax in the eye, his gaze burning with a fierce, newfound clarity. The arrogance that usually defined his interactions with subordinates was gone, replaced by a grim, unbreakable command. "She is not a witness," Vane rumbled, the words dripping with a debt of blood that everyone in the room could feel. "She is the only reason I am breathing. She is the reason Cassian is currently a broken mess in the corner. And if any of you so much as breathe in her direction without her permission, you answer to me personally." The room went deathly silent. The enforcers looked at Zora, really seeing her for the first time. They saw the jagged meat hook still gripped in her hand, the blood that wasn't hers staining her uniform, and the geometric shadow-stitching ink peeking out from her torn collar. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their boss hadn't been saved by luck or his own men. He had been saved by the girl he used to snap his fingers at. Zora didn't say a word. She simply adjusted her stance, taking Vane's weight back onto her shoulder with a quiet, effortless strength. She looked at the circle of armed men, the giants who thought they owned the city, and didn't blink. Vane Thorax, the king of Thorns, rested his heavy head near hers, a silent pact sealed in the darkness of the basement, The debt was absolute. The waitress was gone, and in her place stood the most dangerous ally the Thorax family would ever know. Move. Vane commanded his men, his voice low and dangerous. She's taking me out of here. The basement exploded into a symphony of calculated violence that transcended the messy brawls Vane Thorax was used to. The moment Zora disarmed Cassian, the four hitmen reacted, their fingers tightening on their triggers, but they were already too late. They were fighting a person who didn't exist in their world of street rules and heavy-handed posturing. Zora moved like a shadow caught in a strobe light, a blur of motion that seemed to occupy 3 spaces at once. She didn't retreat. She surged forward into the center of their formation, turning their numerical advantage into a liability. The first hitman, a mountain of a man with a scarred face, tried to swing the barrel of his submachine gun toward her, but Zora was already inside his reach. She used the meat hook not as a tool, but as a surgical extension of her arm. With a flick of her wrist, the steel point found the soft junction of his elbow, severing the tendon with clinical precision. As his weapon clattered to the floor, she stepped on his foot, pinning him in place while she used his massive body as a human shield against the second hitman's line of fire. A burst of suppressed rounds chewed into the first man's tactical vest, and Zora used the momentum of his falling corpse to launch herself at the shooter. Vane watched from the bench, his breath hitching in his chest. He had seen thousands of fights, but he had never seen a dance like this. Zora wasn't just killing, she was dismantling. She moved with a silent, terrifying economy of motion that made the hitmen look like they were underwater. She took the second man down with a palm strike to the throat that collapsed his windpipe, followed instantly by a sweeping kick that shattered his kneecap. He fell with a muffled wheeze, but Zora was already gone, spinning toward the third and fourth targets who were desperately trying to adjust their aim in the flickering, erratic light. The air in the boiler room grew thick with the smell of ozone, copper, and spent brass. Zora snatched a heavy wrench from a nearby pipe rack, using it as a secondary bludgeon. She ducked under a wild swing from the third hitman, coming up beneath his guard and driving the steel tool into the base of his jaw. The crack of bone echoed off the concrete walls like a hammer blow. The fourth man panicked, turning to run for the exit, but Zora's hand found the discarded .45 on the floor. She didn't look, she didn't aim, she simply fired a single, echoing shot that took him through the back of the thigh, dropping him instantly. Cassian was backed against a hissing steam pipe, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at his inner circle, 4 of the most expensive killers in the tri-state area, lying in a heap of broken limbs and silenced voices. None of them had lasted more than 30 seconds. He looked at Zora, and the gun he had once held with such arrogance now seemed like a toy in a child's hand. Zora didn't rush him. She walked toward him with a slow, deliberate pace that was far more frightening than her initial burst of speed. The soot from the explosion and the grease from the boiler room had mixed with the blood of her enemies, coating her skin in a dark, metallic sheen. Her oversized work shirt was torn, revealing the jagged scars and the deep, geometric ink on her shoulders. She looked like a vengeful deity, carved from the very shadows of the basement. When she reached Cassian, she didn't strike him. She simply stood in his personal space, her eyes cold and empty of any human emotion. She was covered in the remnants of the life she had tried to leave behind, a poor waitress who had just systematically erased a tactical team without breaking a sweat. Vane Thorax, the man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and ruled a city through fear, realized in that moment that he was the least dangerous person in the room. He looked at Zora, and for the first time in his life, he felt a genuine shiver of ice travel down his spine. She wasn't just a survivor, she was the storm. Zora reached out and plucked a stray piece of glass from Cassian's hair with a hand that was perfectly steady. "You shouldn't have come to the kitchen, Cassian," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic threat that made his knees buckle. "The service here is terrible." She turned back to Vane, her face a mask of soot and blood, looking more terrifying, more powerful, and more sovereign than the Mafia Boss ever had in his entire life. The King of Thorns was still sitting on his bench, but the throne had clearly moved to the center of the room. The steel door of the boiler room groaned as it was kicked open, the sound echoing like a funeral knell against the concrete walls. Cassian stepped into the humid darkness, his tailored suit miraculously unrumpled, though his eyes were alight with a frantic, jagged energy. Behind him, 4 hitmen fanned out, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the shadows where the massive pipes hissed. Cassian's gaze landed on the rusted bench, where Vane Thorax sat hunched, his 6'8" frame looking uncharacteristically small in the flickering yellow light. Zora stood slightly in front of him, her posture rigid, her oversized work shirt damp with the basement's sweat. Finally, Cassian exhaled, a thin, cruel smile stretching across his face. He stepped forward, raising a chrome-plated 4.5 and aiming it directly at Zora's forehead. "I must admit, Vane, you had me worried. I thought the King of Thorns had vanished into the ether. But here you are, hiding in the dark with the help of a little waitress." He clicked his tongue, the sound sharp and mocking. "Is this what it's come to? The great Vane Thorax reduced to using a servant as a human shield?" Zora didn't move. She didn't tremble. Her eyes remained fixed on Cassian's trigger finger, her breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. The hitmen moved closer, flanking the bench, their weapons trained on Vane's chest. Cassian stepped into Zora's personal space, the barrel of his gun pressing into the soft skin of her temple. He looked over her shoulder at Vane, his expression one of triumphant pity. "She's quite pretty, in a common sort of way," Cassian mused, his voice dripping with malice. "I saw the way you looked at her in the dining room, Vane. You think you're so subtle, but I know a weakness when I see one. You stayed behind to save her, didn't you? You could have crawled out the service tunnel alone, but you dragged this little ant with you instead. And now, she's the reason you're going to watch your empire burn before I put a bullet in your brain." A low, rumbling sound began to emanate from the shadows. It took Cassian a moment to realize that Vane Thorax was laughing. It wasn't a hearty sound. It was a dry, hollow rattle that came from the depths of his bruised chest. Vane looked up, the light hitting his sharp jawline and the intricate ink on his neck. His eyes, usually cold and commanding, were filled with a terrifying, dark amusement. "You really are a fool, Cassian," Vane rumbled, the vibration of his voice making the nearby pipes hum. "You've spent your whole life looking for leverage, but you never learned how to read the weight of the person holding it." He leaned back against the brick wall, ignoring the blood soaking through his waistcoat. "You think you found my weakness? You think I brought her down here to protect her?" Cassian's smile flickered, his grip on the gun tightening. "Shut up, Vane. One more word and I decorate this wall with her brains." "Go ahead and try," Vane said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "But you should know something before you pull that trigger. I didn't bring Zora down here to save her from you. I brought her down here to save you from her." He looked at Zora, a grim, respectful nod passing between them. "You didn't find my weakness, Cassian. You found the only person in this city who can kill you before your brain even tells your finger to squeeze." Cassian's eyes widened, a sudden, cold bolt of instinct shooting down his spine. He looked at Zora, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the apron, the tired eyes, and the poor waitress facade. He saw the way her weight was distributed, the way her hand was positioned near her waist, and the terrifying static stillness of a professional killer. "What are you?" Cassian started to say, but the words died in his throat. Zora moved. It wasn't a human motion. It was a blur of kinetic energy that seemed to bypass the laws of physics. In the heartbeat between Cassian's blink and his next breath, Zora's hand came up, her palm striking the underside of his wrist with enough force to send the chrome 45 flying into the darkness. Before the gun even hit the floor, her other hand had found the meat hook she had hidden in the folds of her oversized shirt. The trap hadn't been the basement, it had been the girl. And the King of Thorns was the only one who knew the slaughter was about to begin. Gemini said, the transition from the kitchen to the basement was a descent into a world of concrete and shadows. Zora guided Vane through the narrow service stairwell, her shoulder acting as a steadying post for his massive frame. Every step was a battle against gravity, the 6'8" Titan leaning heavily on the woman he had once deemed disposable. They reached the boiler room, a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic thrum of machinery and the hiss of pressurized pipes. The air here was thick with the scent of oil and old dust, a far cry from the freezing, sterile silence of the walk-in cooler. Zora eased Vane down onto a rusted metal bench, his back leaning against a warm brick wall that hummed with the building's heartbeat. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the building was still a fortress under siege. Zora turned away from him, peeling off her blood-soaked waitress apron and the tattered remains of her uniform shirt. She needed to check her own mobility. A stray piece of glass had caught her across the shoulder blade. As she moved under the flickering yellow light of a single bare bulb, Vane's eyes widened, the fog of blood loss clearing for a singular, jarring moment of clarity. Across her back, stretching from the nape of her neck to the base of her spine, was a tapestry of ink and scars. These weren't the decorative flourishes of a street soldier or the tribal markings of a common gang. These were geometric, high-density symbols, the distinctive shadow stitching used by the Sector 7 cleaners from the Northern Territories. They were marks of a government-sanctioned wraith, a high-level operative trained to erase entire organizations from the inside out. Interspersed with the ink were the silver lines of old bullet wounds and the jagged remnants of shrapnel tears. It was a map of a life lived in the darkest corners of the world, a history written in pain and cold precision. Vane stared at the marks, his breath catching in his chest. He looked at the ink climbing his own neck, symbols of his power and his status, and realized they were like a child's drawings compared to the grim reality etched into Zora's skin. The silence in the basement became heavy, no longer just a pause in the violence, but a profound recognition between two predators. Sector 7, Vane rasped, his voice cracking the stillness. I heard stories about the cleaners when I was rising through the ranks. They said you were myths, ghost stories told to keep capos from stepping out of line. They said one operative could dismantle a family in a weekend. He looked at her, his cold gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like respect. You didn't just survive that life, Zora. You were the heart of it. Zora didn't turn around immediately. She pulled a clean, oversized work shirt from a locker, her movements stiff but practiced. I was a tool, Vane, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. And tools don't have names, they just have functions. I came here to stop being a weapon. I wanted to see if I could handle being invisible, just for a while. I thought serving water and taking insults was a fair price for a quiet life. Vane looked down at his blood-stained hands, then back at her. The arrogance that had defined him for years, the belief that he was the apex predator simply because of his height and his cruelty, evaporated in the heat of the boiler room. He saw himself in her, a monster trying to wear a human mask, a creature defined by the violence he exerted on the world. They were two of a kind, mirror images separated only by the titles they claimed. I called you an ant, Vane said, the words coming out low and heavy. He looked her in the eyes, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side. I told my men you were disposable. I spent months looking at you and never once saw the person standing in front of me. He paused, a rare shadow of humility crossing his sharp, jaw-lined face. I underrated you, Zora. Not just as a soldier, but as a person. I'm sorry. I didn't think there was anyone in this city who walked a darker path than mine. Zora finally turned to face him, the oversized shirt hanging off her frame. She didn't accept the apology with a smile. She acknowledged it with a slow, solemn nod. Apologies don't stop bullets, Vane, but they're a start. She reached for the meat hook she had carried from the kitchen, her grip tightening. Cassian is still up there, and he's bringing more men. We don't have time for a heart-to-heart. Can you stand? Vane gritted his teeth, the King of Thorns finding a new well of strength, not in his ego, but in the presence of an equal. He gripped the edge of the bench and forced his 6'8" frame upward, towering over the machinery, but no longer looking down on the woman beside him. If you're leading the way, Zora, he rumbled, I'll walk through fire. The first hitman didn't even have time to scream. As his boots hit the chemical slick Zora had poured across the entrance, his legs went out from under him with a violent, sickening crack. Before his back could touch the tiles, Zora was on him. She didn't use a gun. The noise would only draw the rest of the pack too quickly. Instead, she swung the heavy cast-iron skillet with a short, brutal arc, connecting with the man's temple in a muffled thud that ended his involvement in the night. She caught his body before it could make a sound, dragging him into the darkness of the dishwashing station. In the freezer, Vane Thorax watched the silhouette of his waitress move through the narrow gap in the door. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones, making his muscles stiff and his thoughts sluggish, but the adrenaline kept his eyes locked on her. He saw the way she moved, not with the heavy, swaggering confidence of his street soldiers, but with a silent, predatory economy. Every step she took was calculated to stay in the blind spots of the swinging kitchen doors. A second hitman pushed through, more cautious than the first. He had his tactical light mounted to his rifle, the beam cutting through the steam and smoke in erratic, nervous jerks. He saw the empty grease trap and the mess on the floor, but he didn't see Zora. She was high above him, her feet braced against the industrial shelving units. As the man stepped over the chemical slick, Zora pulled the release valve on the overhead steam pipe. A pressurized cloud of scalding white vapor erupted directly into the hitman's face. He let out a choked cry, dropping his rifle to claw at his boiling skin. Zora dropped from the shelves like a ghost, her boning knife finding the soft gap between his helmet and his collar. She lowered him to the floor as if he were made of glass. Vane could take it no longer. The instinct to lead, to command, and to dominate was a fire in his chest that even the freezing air couldn't extinguish. He forced himself upright, his massive frame trembling with the effort. He pushed the freezer door open another inch, the frost crackling. "Zora," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly command. "The third one. He's circling the service entrance. Take the rifle from the floor. Move to the flanking position by the pantry. If you draw them into a crossfire, I can." Zora spun around, her face partially obscured by the shadows and the lingering steam. She was at his side in 2 strides, her movement so fast he didn't even see her feet move. She didn't look at him with the deference of a server. She looked at him with the cold, hard eyes of an officer in the middle of a war zone. She placed a bloody hand flat against his chest, pushing him back against the crates with a strength that defied her size. "Shut up, Vane," she whispered, her voice a sharp, clinical blade that cut through his pride. Vane's jaw tightened, his ego flaring. "I am the head of the Thorax family. I don't take." "You're the boss in the streets, Vane." She cut him off mid-sentence, her face inches from his. "Out there, you're a god. But in this kitchen, you're just a liability. You're loud, you're bleeding, and you're slow. Right now, you aren't a king. You're cargo." She leaned in closer, the scent of copper and industrial soap clinging to her. "If you want to see tomorrow, you will sit down, you will stay in the dark, and you will bleed quietly. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a shattered hierarchy. For the first time in his life, Vane Thorax looked into the eyes of another person and felt completely, utterly outclassed. He looked at the blood on her apron, then at the 2 silent heaps on the kitchen floor. He realized that the woman standing before him wasn't playing a role. The waitress had been the mask. This lethal, cold-blooded tactician, was the reality. He slowly sank back onto the crates, his massive tattooed hand falling away from his side. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, a gesture of total surrender. Zora didn't wait for a thank you. She turned back toward the shadows, her eyes refocusing on the kitchen doors. The invisible girl was gone, and the predator had returned to her hunt. Outside, Cassian was still talking, but Vane wasn't listening to him anymore. He was watching the girl who had just demoted him to a passenger in his own life. The heavy steel door of the freezer acted as a thin veil between the frozen silence of the dead and the predatory noise of the living. Inside, the temperature continued to drop, turning Vane's breath into rhythmic ghosts of white vapor. Outside, the sounds of the Bistro Noir had changed. The frantic crunching of glass under tactical boots had slowed into a deliberate, arrogant stroll. Then came a voice, smooth as polished marble and twice as cold. It was Cassian, the architect of the evening's carnage and the only man in the city with enough ego to challenge the throne of Thorax. "Vane, come out. Come out, wherever you are," Cassian called, his voice echoing through the hollowed-out dining room. "I know you're in here somewhere, bleeding out on the floor like a dog. It's a bit pathetic, don't you think? To build a kingdom of iron only to be unseated by a single grenade and a few minutes of darkness. I expected more from the great King of Thorns. At the very least, I expected you to die with your eyes open." Inside the freezer, Vane's fingers twitched against the frosted floor. His muscles, usually his greatest asset, felt like leaden weights. He looked up at Zora, his commanding gaze replaced by a look of helpless fury. He wanted to stand, to roar, to crush Cassian's skull with his bare hands, but the reality of his mangled side and the freezing air kept him anchored to the crates. He was a spectator in his own assassination. Zora didn't look at him. She was already moving, her mind a high-speed processor evaluating the geometry of the kitchen. She knew the freezer wouldn't hold forever. Cassian's men were professional enough to check every corner. Staying hidden was a slow death sentence. To survive, she had to turn the invisible nature of her workspace into a weapon. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice barely a vibration. "If the door opens and it isn't me, use the meat hook. Aim for the soft tissue under the jaw." Vane watched, mesmerized and terrified, as she slipped out of the freezer. Through the crack in the door, he saw her transform the kitchen into a slaughterhouse. She didn't reach for a gun, she reached for the physics of the room. She moved to the industrial fryers, her hands blurring as she bypassed the safety sensors, cranking the temperature dials until the oil began to pop and scream. She unscrewed the caps on the heavy canisters of cleaning chemicals, pouring the slick, caustic liquids across the tiled floor in front of the swinging doors, creating a frictionless trap that smelled of lemon and death. She moved with a terrifying, silent economy of motion. She took a set of heavy professional skewers from the prep station and began wedging them into the gaps of the wooden floorboards at an upward angle, creating a field of hidden spikes beneath the swirling smoke. Every movement was a testament to her earlier chilling words. She had lived in a world where size meant nothing and survival meant everything. Cassian's voice grew louder, closer. "You know what the problem with giants is, Vane? They never look down. They're so busy staring at the sun, they don't see the hole at their feet." Zora positioned herself in the deepest shadow of the dishwashing station. She picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand and a sharpened boning knife in the other. She wasn't trembling. Her heart rate remained at a steady, resting pace, even as the kitchen doors began to creak open. She looked back at the freezer door for a fleeting second, her eyes meeting Vane's through the narrow gap. In that moment, the 6'8" Mafia Boss felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since childhood. True, unadulterated vulnerability. He realized that his life, his legacy, and his very breath were no longer his to defend. They belonged to the waitress he had insulted. The first hitman stepped into the kitchen, his boots sliding instantly on the chemical slick Zora had prepared. As he went down, his weapon firing a wild burst into the ceiling, Zora moved like a shadow detached from its light. She didn't hesitate. She didn't offer mercy. She became the circumstance that would show Vane Thorax the true meaning of strength. The hunter had become the hunted, and the kitchen was no longer a place of service. It was a kill zone. The smell of burnt gunpowder was quickly replaced by the sterile, biting scent of industrial-grade Freon as Zora hauled Vane Thorax through the wreckage of the kitchen. It was a feat of pure mechanical leverage. She wasn't as broad as the titan she was dragging, but she knew exactly where to grip his expensive suit to move his 6'8" frame without snagging on the debris. Vane's heels kicked weakly against the linoleum, his head lolling against his chest as the blood loss finally began to dim the edges of his vision. Every few seconds, Zora would pause, her ears straining for the heavy crunch of boots in the dining room, before she heaved him another few feet toward the heavy, stainless steel door of the walk-in freezer. With a grunt of concentrated effort, she swung the massive door open, a cloud of artificial winter billowing out to meet them. She pulled him inside the cold room, the heavy latch clicking shut with a finality that felt like a tomb. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the wet, ragged sound of Vane's breathing. She slumped him against a stack of crates, his massive silhouette casting a distorted shadow against the frosted walls. The temperature dropped instantly, the moisture from the steam pipes outside freezing into a fine powder on his eyelashes. Vane's eyes fluttered open, his pupils blown wide from shock. He watched through a haze of pain as Zora moved with chilling efficiency. She didn't panic. She didn't weep. Instead, she reached up and unhooked a heavy stainless steel meat hook from a sliding rail, testing its weight before setting it on a prep table. From her apron pocket, she pulled a white linen tablecloth, one she had folded just an hour ago for a guest, and began tearing it into long, surgical strips with a serrated steak knife she had tucked into her waistband. "What are you doing?" Vane rasped, his voice a ghost of its former thunder. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his side, and he collapsed back against the crates, a spray of dark blood hitting the frosted floor. Zora didn't answer immediately. She knelt beside him, her hands moving with a terrifying, practiced speed. She ripped away the ruined silk of his crimson waistcoat, exposing the jagged entry wound where a piece of shrapnel or a stray bullet had carved through his muscular flank. She didn't flinch at the sight of the pulsing red. She took the meat hook, using the blunt end to create a makeshift tension point, and began to weave the tablecloth strips through his skin with the steak knife acting as a needle. It was brutal, primitive, and hauntingly precise. Vane's hand shot out, his tattooed fingers clamping onto her shoulder in a reflex of pure agony. His grip was enough to crush a normal person's collarbone, but Zora didn't even blink. She leaned into the pressure, her eyes locked on the wound. "Breathe through the teeth, Vane," she commanded, her voice as cold as the air around them. "If you scream, they find us. If you die, I have to carry you back out, and you're a heavy man." He stared at her, the sheer absurdity of the situation piercing through his fading consciousness. He was the king of Thorns, a man who had built an empire on the broken bones of his enemies, and here he was, being stitched together by a girl he had called disposable, using a meat hook and a dining cloth in a freezer. He watched the way her fingers moved. They weren't shaking. They were steady, rhythmic, possessed of a knowledge that didn't belong in a bistro. "Who are you?" he whispered, his head falling back against the cold steel wall as the cold began to numb the worst of the fire in his side. "I've had soldiers, men who spent 10 years in the special forces. None of them could stitch a gut wound like a combat surgeon while hitmen were 10 feet away." He coughed, a fleck of blood hitting his lip. "Where did a waitress learn to do that?" Zora finished the final knot, pulling the cloth tight enough to staunch the flow. She stood up, wiping the blood from her hands onto her apron, her expression unreadable in the dim, blue light of the freezer. She looked down at him, her silhouette towering over him in a way his height never allowed. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood something ancient and dangerous. "You think the world is small because you're tall, Vane," she said, her voice dropping into a register that made the hair on his arms stand up. "You think strength is about who you can see, but I didn't learn this in a school or a gym." She stepped closer, her shadow swallowing him. "I learned this in a place you aren't big enough to survive. Now sit still. The frost will help the swelling. I have to go finish the dishes." The world was a muffled roar of white noise and stinging heat. Vane Thorax lay amidst the wreckage of his own arrogance, his lungs burning with the intake of pulverized drywall and expensive cognac. The ceiling of the Bistro Noir had partially collapsed, and a massive mahogany support beam now pinned his lower legs to the floor. For a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, the sensation of being trapped was an alien, suffocating terror. He groaned, a guttural sound of primal frustration as he tried to heave the weight off him, but a sharp, hot lance of pain in his side told him his ribs had fared poorly against the shockwave. Blood, thick and dark, began to seep through the deep crimson of his waistcoat, staining the silk a muddy, ominous black. 20 feet away, through the swirling curtains of gray smoke and falling embers, he could see the carnage. His elite security detail, the men he had bragged were the best in the city, had been erased. They lay like broken dolls among the overturned tables, caught in the initial blast before they could even draw their weapons. The silence that followed the explosion was short-lived, replaced quickly by the heavy rhythmic crunch of tactical boots on shattered glass. The hitmen were moving in to finish the job, their silhouettes ghost-like in the haze. Vane's hand clawed at the floor, his fingers straining toward his custom Glock that had skittered across the tiles during the blast. It sat just inches beyond his reach, a taunting glimmer of steel in the gloom. Zora, he wheezed, the name catching in his throat. He expected her to be gone, either a corpse in the rubble or a coward running for the service entrance. After all, he had called her disposable. He had told the world she was an ant. But Zora was not running. She was crouching low behind the remnants of the marble bar, her movements so fluid and calculated they seemed to defy the chaos around her. Her eyes, once masked with service industry boredom, were now sharp enough to cut through the smoke. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like a predator that had finally been let off its leash. As the first assassin rounded the corner of the bar, his submachine gun raised to sweep the room, Zora moved. It wasn't a panicked scramble. It was a blur of high-velocity precision. She didn't have a gun. She didn't need one. Her hand shot out, snatching the jagged neck of a shattered Cabernet bottle from the floor. Before the hitman could register her presence, she was inside his guard. She drove the glass into the soft gap of his tactical vest at the shoulder, the force of her strike popping the joint. As the man let out a choked gasp, she pivoted, using his own momentum to slam his head into the edge of the marble counter. It was a move born of terrifying muscle memory, a sequence of violence so refined it could only have been forged in a life of deep shadows. She caught his weapon before it hit the floor, checked the chamber with a practiced flick of her wrist, and vanished back into the smoke before the man's body even settled. Vane watched from the floor, his breath hitching in his chest. The pain in his legs was forgotten, replaced by a cold, prickling awe. He had spent his life studying men, judging their lethality by the size of their arms and the coldness of their talk. He had looked at Zora for months and seen nothing. Now, watching her move through the debris like a phantom, he realized his error. She wasn't just surviving, she was hunting. She moved with a silent, predatory grace that made his own vaunted strength feel clumsy and decorative. A second hitman appeared from the kitchen, firing a blind burst into the center of the room. The bullets chewed through the wood of Vane's table, showering him in splinters. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, but the gunfire stopped abruptly. He opened them to see Zora standing behind the man, her arm wrapped around his throat in a professional sleeper hold, while her other hand drove a steak knife into the base of his skull. She lowered the corpse to the ground without a sound, her expression as calm as if she were still pouring room-temperature water. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Vane. There was no pity in her eyes, only a grim, tactical assessment. She began to move toward him, stepping over the bodies of the giants he had hired to protect him. The power dynamic of the room had shifted irrevocably. The King of Thorns was bleeding in the dirt, and the invisible girl was the only thing standing between him and the grave. "Stay still, Vane," she whispered, her voice a sharp blade in the dark. "I'm coming for you." The heavy glass doors of Bistro Noir didn't just open for Vane Thorax. They seemed to retreat in fear. At 6 feet, 8 inches tall, Vane was a mountain of tailored silk and cold aggression. His presence was a physical weight that settled over the dining room, silencing the soft clink of silverware and the low murmur of jazz. He wore a midnight black Italian suit that stretched over shoulders like granite, and as he moved, the deep crimson of his waistcoat flashed like a fresh wound. An intricate black ink tattoo climbed his neck, disappearing into a jawline so sharp it looked carved from obsidian. He didn't look at the people around him. To Vane, they were merely shadows in a world he owned. Behind him trailed a retinue of stone-faced men, but they looked like children standing in his wake. Vane pulled out the center chair at the most prominent table, his massive, tattooed hand resting on the mahogany surface with a grounded, terrifying stillness. He didn't ask for a menu. He didn't look at the staff. He simply existed, and the world was expected to pivot around him. Zora approached the table with a gait that was fluid and silent, a sharp contrast to the heavy, rhythmic thud of Vane's footsteps. Her uniform was pressed and pristine, her dark skin glowing under the amber chandelier light, but her eyes were where the story lay. They were calm, too calm for someone standing in the shadow of a predator. She held a silver tray with a single glass of water, room temperature, exactly as he demanded every Tuesday. Vane was mid-sentence, leaning toward a nervous associate. "Power isn't about who you can kill," he rumbled, his voice a tectonic shift. "It's about who you can make disappear without ever lifting a finger." He finally sensed Zora's presence and snapped his fingers, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Water, and move the bread. It's taking up space for my files." Zora placed the glass with mathematical precision. As she reached for the bread basket, Vane's hand shot out, his fingers, thick and decorated with ink, clamping around her wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break bone, but the threat was there. He looked at her then, his cold, commanding gaze raking over her as if she were a faulty piece of machinery. "You're slow today, Zora," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching into a cruel smirk. He turned to his associates, laughing softly. "Look at this. This is the face of the working class. Low tier, disposable. You see a girl like this, and you realize how easy it is to be a king. As long as there are ants willing to carry the crumbs, the giants never have to look down." The associates chuckled nervously. Zora didn't flinch. She didn't pull her arm away. Instead, her eyes drifted past Vane's massive shoulder toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the rain-slicked street. A black van had pulled up, its headlights off. Two men were stepping out, their movements synchronized, their hands hidden under long coats. One of them adjusted a heavy object that caught the street lamp's glow, a cylindrical metallic shape that Zora recognized with a jolt of dormant instinct. "Mr. Thorax," Zora said, her voice dropping into a low, steady frequency that cut through his laughter. "I told you not to speak," Vane hissed, releasing her wrist with a dismissive flick. "The black van," she continued, her gaze locked on the reflection in the window. 3 o'clock. They aren't here for the food. The man on the left is carrying a M79. You have approximately 4 seconds before this room becomes an oven." Vane barked a laugh, leaning back in his chair and spreading his massive arms. "A waitress giving security advice? Stick to the appetizers, Zora. My men are the best in the—" He never finished the sentence. Zora didn't wait for him to believe her. She saw the flash of the muzzle. In one explosive motion, the low-tier girl he had just mocked grabbed the collar of his expensive suit and yanked. The sheer leverage of her movement, combined with the suddenness of her strike, sent the 6'8" Titan sprawling backward off his chair just as the world turned into fire. The grenade tore through the front window, and the Bistro Noir died in a roar of orange flame and screaming steel. The shockwave shattered every bottle at the bar, sending a rain of glass over the screaming patrons. Vane hit the floor hard, his ears ringing, the smell of cordite and burning silk filling his lungs. As the smoke swirled, he looked up, coughing, his vision blurred. Standing over him was Zora. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't screaming. She was holding a jagged piece of the mahogany table like a tactical shield, her eyes scanning the debris with the cold, lethal precision of a general. The ant had just saved the giant, and the night was only beginning. The heavy scent of expensive tobacco and ironed silk followed Vane Thorax into the room long before his shadow did. At 6'8", he didn't just enter a space, he occupied it. He pulled out a chair at the center table, the mahogany groaning under his weight. Without looking up from his encrypted tablet, he snapped 2 fingers, a sharp, whip-like sound that cut through the soft jazz of the restaurant. "Water, room temperature, and don't speak unless I'm looking at you." He rumbled, his voice a low vibration that made the silverware on the table tremble. Zora stood 3 feet away, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of bored professionality. She didn't flinch, she didn't blush. She simply adjusted the tray in her hand, her thumb brushing against a faint, jagged scar on her palm, a relic of a life she had tried to bury. She saw the bulge of the Glock 17 beneath his crimson waistcoat and the way his tattooed hand gripped the table like he was ready to flip it. "Understood, Mr. Thorax," she said, her voice like cool silk. He didn't notice the way she scanned the room behind him, her eyes marking the 3 exits, the blind spots of the security cameras, and the suspicious black van idling across the street. To him, she was just part of the furniture. To her, he was a target waiting to happen,